I'm Samantha Anderl, co-founder of Harlow, an all-in-one tool for freelancers to manage their business. I'm a former marketing executive and a former and current marketing consultant for early stage tech companies. So I am joined today by my co-founder, Andrea Wilt, and Jay Dolwani, founder of The Starters. So that's a marketplace that he's building to help e-commerce companies find the best pre-vetted freelance talent for their projects. So since Jay is really closely familiar with freelance marketplaces, that's actually what we're going to dive into today. So we're going to talk about how to know if getting listed on a freelance marketplace is the right move for you, how to stand out on those platforms, and really just take this conversation wherever else it goes. So super excited to discuss this today because promoting yourself and finding the right channels to find clients is really important, right? Whether you are a new freelancer or an experienced freelancer. And in fact, Andrea and I have done a number of surveys to our audience. And what we see over and over again is that finding clients is actually a freelancer's number one pain point, or at least that's what they're telling us. So that was actually the inspiration for our recent job board that we launched, which is also focused on helping freelancers connect with open roles. So before we go any deeper, I'm going to pass it over to Andrea and Jay for them to tell us a little bit more about themselves. So Andrea, let's start with you, and then we'll pass things over to Jay.
Perfect. Andrea Wilt, most of you watching this probably already know me right now, by now. Samantha's co-founder at Harlow. I've been a freelancer off and on for 15 years, and I am particularly excited about this conversation because when I started freelancing, marketplaces didn't really exist. And it just wasn't a channel to generate clients. And we've just seen this, proliferation of marketplaces, specifically these really specialized ones. And so I think this is just such a cool opportunity for freelancers to take advantage of. And I'm really excited just to learn more about how freelancers can leverage marketplaces.
Amazing. And I'm Jay Dolwani. My career has hopped around. I started out in consulting, did some startups, but really found my passion for e-commerce. Right at the start of the pandemic, I was cooped up at home. I had some free time, and I decided to launch a Shopify store in the auto parts space because we already had the product. That's what my family was in, and I really enjoyed it. And so I went from tech startups to joining an e-commerce business called Wink. It's a direct-to-consumer wine business where I joined as director of retention. Absolutely loved it. Worked my way through the ranks, eventually becoming their CMO over the next couple of years, where we had a really interesting experience. We were a hyper-growth company through the pandemic, actually went public, and then things completely changed. The macroeconomic environment changed. Freight rates got expensive. DTC got tougher when it came to client acquisition. And we were spread thin across DTC, across wholesale, across building brands, across acquiring companies. And we went from a massive hiring to a mass layoff cycle. I actually had to go through 4 rounds of layoffs for my team, which is where I became really passionate about not only growing companies sustainably, but also how you could leverage fractional talent to do that. So I left in January of 23 to go build my own company, The Starters, which you've given a great background on, but we focus on a curated set of vetted talent specific for the needs of e-commerce businesses. I've been doing that for the last 8 months, and it's been a ton of fun.
I love that. I was actually a customer at Wink, so I'm very familiar with the brand and company. And I think I might have come across you, Jay, when you were working there as CMO. I know that we've seen each other on social across the years before we actually connected. So I'm super pumped to be chatting with you today. And I'm super pumped to see what you're doing with The Starters. It's helping freelancers is obviously a passion of mine, but also connecting with all of the other people in this space that are also passionate about helping freelancers and building in the space is really cool, right? It's cool to find the people that are passionate about the same things, that are helping the same people and having conversations with those people. So thanks for jumping on with us today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm excited.
Yeah, we're gonna start a little high level, right? Because marketplaces, so some freelancers have used marketplaces in the past. Some freelancers have never used marketplaces in the past. Marketplaces, some of them, there's a negative connotation with some marketplaces. Some people love marketplaces. And so from the very top, I want to talk about if you're a freelancer or a consultant, how do you know if getting listed on or joining a marketplace is a good strategy for you?
Yeah, so I think it's really not about if getting listed is a good strategy for you. I
Mhm.
think it's about where for the most part. And I think
Love
there
that.
are really three categories of people. One is you have a full time job, you are absolutely crushing it there, and you love it, right? For that category, I would go join something like an intro.co or MentorPass where you can give a couple hours a week to network with other people, get paid for your time, but more importantly, broaden your scope and really see what you're great at and where you can help people. If you have a full time job and you have 10 to 15 hours a week to potentially spend with another brand, maybe join a private gated marketplace where your profile is not public. That's what we do at the starters. You can join
Mhm.
staffing agency networks. There are a lot of places where you can go for that, where you're able to freelance, but not necessarily advertise that you're freelancing.
Yeah.
And then I think the third category is you're a full time freelancer, right? And this is where most people who freelance fit into. It's everything that you do. And in that case, I would join as many marketplaces in your niche as it makes sense to, where you can consistently keep up and update a profile. Because if you're joining 20 marketplaces and you have 20 profiles to maintain, that's going to be a lot. And you're ultimately not going to do a great job in any of them. So I
Mhm.
would join, 4, 5, 6 different marketplaces where you can really stay active, maintain a great profile, maintain great response times within your specific niche. So that's kind of how I think about listing on freelancer marketplaces. I think it's more of like, where should I go? Even if you have a full time job, you don't want to freelance, I still suggest kind of broadening your network, getting on a place where you can offer some time. And of course, the more time that you have, the more bandwidth that you have to take on clients, the more marketplaces you want to be on.
I love that you broke down freelancers into those three categories. And as you were going through them, I was thinking about people in my network that fit into each of these buckets, right? And I'm like, oh
Yeah.
yeah, that's a good call. That's a good call. Andrew and I actually we're growing Harlow and we are bootstrapping it. We actually just had a mini conversation about this before we jumped on. But we're bootstrapping the business. And so we recently started thinking about how do we like just make money while we're building Harlow and bootstrapping the business, right? We launched the company 2 years ago. We haven't paid ourselves a salary. We're like, how do we supplement this? And so that first bucket was actually something that we thought about a lot, was giving like a couple hours a week or doing some like very high level consulting. So it's interesting to break people into those three categories. You mentioned specifically that something like the starters is really helpful in that second category, right? So the person who wants to take on maybe a client or two, but they don't want to fully advertise that they are, maybe freelancing or that they are open to work. Talk to me a little bit more about that group that you see using the starters.
Yeah, so I wanted to make this platform the most friendly platform for that group in particular. And here's why. Our target customer and the need that I'm trying to fulfill is that early to mid stage e commerce brand that knows the value of great talent. They've
Mhm.
gone to the Upworks of the world and maybe it served a purpose at the start, but ultimately they want the people who have been there and done that before in specific roles,
Yeah.
but they don't want to pay an arm and a leg to a staffing agency or for a full time person in that particular role because it's just not needed.
Mhm.
And so our strategy was actually to go out and say, what are the best brands in e-commerce? Who is absolutely crushing it there? And who are the people in those roles behind those brands? And
Mhm.
what can I develop to get them to freelance for 5, 10, 15 hours a week with some of those earlier stage brands?
Mhm.
Because the value that they could bring to those earlier stage brands who are doing it for the first time is really incomparable to any other type of talent that you could get. So that was really the focus from the start. And what I found is that most of them are actually open to freelancing evenings and weekends. The
Mhm.
problem is they don't want to advertise that they're freelancing because they want to respect their full-time employer. And
Yep.
so we made it a completely private marketplace where they can create their profile and only member brands can access it. And another thing they were looking for is somebody that wasn't going to take an arm and a leg when it came to what they make. Right, you
Yep.
can see
Mhm.
staffing agencies take up to a 50 to 75% take rate, really compressing the take for the freelancer. And if for somebody who has a full time job, it almost doesn't become worth it at that point. So that was the second thing, and the third is the type of work that they want to do. Since we focus specifically in e-commerce, and that is our niche, the brands actually have to pay to access the platform. Not only are they in the right niche, but they're very high intent. The freelancers aren't going to waste a ton of money on these introductory scoping calls, develop huge proposals only to not get the actual client themselves. So that's actually where we're focusing on. And I think the overall trend towards remote work is really increasing both the supply as well as demand of freelancers in that category. And that's what we're going after.
I love that. Two things that really stood out to me in what you just said. One was freelancers obviously being very sensitive to platforms taking a cut of their money, right? Like people are freelancing, they want to keep as much of their money as possible. We see that across the board, right? Freelancers are just hesitant to spend money, whether it's getting work, managing their business, etc., because they work really hard for that money, right? And they want to keep as much of those hard-earned dollars as possible. So that stood out to me. And the second thing that you said that also stood out to me was freelancers don't want to waste time, right? Like putting together proposals and putting together statements of work and meeting with people, if it's not going to actually, build into a relationship and a future client. And I kind of want to go into that second piece, right? Because I think there's a lot that goes into that. And one of the things that goes into that is freelancers understanding how to position themselves and how to stand out on these specific platforms, like, even the starters. So do you have any tips for freelancers, whether they're getting listed on, any of those types of marketplaces that you're talking about, the starters or any others? Like, how does a freelancer actually stand out and make sure they're positioning themselves well so that it's easier to land clients?
Yeah, this is something that I think about all the time because we try to balance supply and demand as much as possible, which means that I'm actively looking out to make sure all of our freelancers are getting proposals. And so a big focus on that is going to be on that profile itself. So a few things that I've seen over the months. Number one is you have to tell a cohesive story across the roles that you've done in the past, the companies you have experience with, your bio and your case studies for your ICP. If you're on a platform like the starters, you don't want to be talking about your experience with big B2B companies like Oracle or SAP. You want to talk about your experience with e-commerce brands and how you help e-commerce brands. So
Yeah.
very similar to marketing, you're creating an ad. You can think about this as an ad for your ICP, and you want to tell that cohesive story. The second thing is social proof is king. The more reviews, the more relevant companies that you've worked at, the more likely you are to get work through a specific platform. Well, the people we see on our platform get the most number of engagements are the ones who have experience with brands that we all know and love. Hexclad, Ridge Wallet, The Farmer's Dog, Liquid Death. Those companies and experience at that company speaks volume in terms of social proof. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that just because you have good company experience, you're going to be a great freelancer, but it's a great leading indicator for brands, and they really look for that. And then the third thing that I will say, and this should seem so obvious, but you'd be stunned at the number of people that don't do it, have a high quality profile photo. Like, it's very simple. Get it done. That's your first impression that you're making on someone. So that's the third thing that I would say. Really telling a cohesive story that's meant for your ICP, really making sure that you have good social proof and just having a great profile photo.
I love that. Actually, Andrew and I talk about positioning a lot. So would you say that a number of the freelancers on the starters are marketers specifically?
Yeah, we focus on marketing, creative, and a little bit of technology like data
Okay.
analytics, and we're getting into Shopify developers. But I would say about 60% of our talent is marketing focused.
So it's really interesting because marketers have a deep understanding for this, right? You have a deep understanding for this. You have a CMO background. Andrew and I have a marketing background. We understand how important positioning and the cohesiveness of how you're presenting yourself is when landing new clients. But when you get outside of, the marketing and the creatives, there are a lot of people who just don't have that skill set, right? Like they don't understand positioning and how to present yourself. And so I always think that's really interesting is that, we as marketers, we're like, it sounds so simple, right? Like make it cohesive, reference the exact, reference the right background story, make sure that your profile picture looks good, like make sure everything's like in a certain sequence, right? And that just doesn't come easy for a lot of people.
Yeah, and another thing that I will say is that it is so different for when it's your job versus when you're actually trying to sell yourself, because people
Totally.
sometimes apply this much of what they're actually good at and they don't apply it to themselves.
Yes, I was going to say the same thing. And I think that sometimes it's hard to see what you're really good at in with your own clients. You know,
Yeah.
you're like, oh, well, that's easy to me. I don't need to promote the fact that I'm awesome at client management or communication or those things, because that's just something you normally do. This is something I've actually loved about working with Samantha and having a business partner, is that you have somebody to like give you that feedback and be like, oh, you should work on this part and promote this part.
Yes. I love that you said that, Andrea, because yeah, you can do work for a company and do positioning for a company, do branding for a company, but doing positioning and branding for yourself is a completely different story. And there's a little bit of like, I think I don't know if it's like removing your ego from it, but it's kind of hard to take a step back and tell a story about yourself. I think it's much easier to tell a story about a company that you're not necessarily attached to, right? But figuring out your positioning statements and figuring out like what value you actually bring and then being able to back that up, that's hard.
I think people are naturally shy, and I was the same way. Like, it is so hard to brag about yourself and talk about yourself in a
Yes.
good light. And the analogy that I'll bring is when I first started launching the starters, I tried to create content on LinkedIn and Twitter, and it really didn't go anywhere. And I think over time, I just recognized that I wasn't sharing why I was qualified to say this, to preach this type of content. And the second that I started doing that, like, hey, I was a CMO at a public company at 26. Hey, I've bootstrapped the starters to X dollars in revenue. And actually sharing that I have authority in the space,
Mm-hmm.
things completely changed. And
Mm-hmm.
so, very similarly for freelancers, like, don't be humble. Now's not the time to be humble. Don't be shy.
Yes.
Put yourself out there, share what you've accomplished, and be proud of it and own it. And I think that's really important for everyone who's freelancing to know, because not only will you get more engagements, you will be able to significantly increase your rate as well.
Yes. You when you were just talking, I was like, yes, I relate to that. I totally relate to that. Like when it's I love that you are comparing it to first starting to like create on maybe social media and promoting yourself there, because I had the same experience, right? You start writing content for social media, you start putting it out there, but until you're really like sharing from the heart, like until you're really like sharing your experiences and being really open and transparent, and again talking about why you are an authority and why people should listen to you and why they should care, you're not going to get picked up. Right. And so that was actually one thing that Andrea and I really struggled with. And I'm way more comfortable on the self-promotion side, but I haven't always been, but I've gotten there over the years because it's a big tool for our business, right? Like me posting on social media, me promoting us, me talking about what we're doing. That's a major channel for us. But I remember this specific blog post that I wanted Andrea and I to write, and it was about how we built our consulting business into $1 million business. And Andrea was like, no, we cannot talk about this. And I was like, Andrea, it gives so much authority to what we're talking about, right? The fact that we're telling people how to streamline their business, how to, how to outsource, how they can hire, how they can do all these things, letting them know that we actually did it very successfully. And here's our story lends a ton of authority to what we're doing and building, but it's really hard and it can feel really icky.
Yeah.
And I know that Andrea feels that more than I do. And I think it's also, there are a lot of introverts that are freelancers, right? Like I'm an extrovert to the max. And so I have an easier time sharing and talking about what we're doing and, all of that. And I think, Andrea's a little bit more on the introverted side, has a harder time. And there's a lot of like creators out there that I think fit into that bucket, that it's really, really hard to talk about themselves.
Well, it's easier one-to-one than one-to-many, right? And so
Yes.
This is where like social is hard for me. So I don't really have much of a preference, a presence on social media, because that just doesn't come naturally. But a one-on-one conversation, I'm happy to tell you. I will tell you everything about how we built our business. So this is kind of the interesting thing about a marketplace, right? Because it is somewhat public. Like you have to put certain things out there, but then I'm assuming you still get that one-on-one being able to sell yourself directly once you've hooked the client at least to say, yes, I want to learn more.
Yeah, once you've made the connection. And another great thing for freelancers, as we're talking about kind of us posting on social, is not only can they rely on marketplaces, but if they promote their personal brand on LinkedIn and their authority on Twitter or X, that's going to increase the number of clients that they can get as well. Very similarly, when I was posting about the starters and kind of starting to share my authority in the space, I got reached out to by multiple brands to consult in fractional CMO. I actually ended up taking one of them on because it was the perfect case study for the starters, removing some of the agencies they were working with and bringing in freelancers. But I wasn't even talking about freelancing, and they were coming in. So it's incredible once you put yourself out there, what that can do. Even if you are just a freelancer, you can rely on more than just the marketplaces. And social isn't something that comes natural to me either. I never post on Instagram for my personal Instagram. I never post on Facebook, and I never posted on LinkedIn or Twitter before I needed to for the business. But once I got comfortable and started doing it, or got comfortable with being uncomfortable and started doing it, it really changes the economics and the business side of things.
I love the phrase getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, because I think that is, I've felt that so many times when freelancing, when growing a business. You do have to just get comfortable with being uncomfortable. I love that phrase. I feel like I'm gonna put that in my back pocket and pull it out. So we've talked a little bit about how to stand out on these platforms. We've talked a little bit on talked a little bit about which platforms are right for, what groups of freelancers. I want to take a step back, and I want to talk about the biggest mistakes that you see people making when they're thinking about marketplaces. What are whether there's like 2 or 3 things that you're like, just don't do this, don't think about it this way, don't have this expectation, whatever it is.
Yeah, so I would say 2 big mistakes that I've come across. The first is really solvable, and that is they treat their profile on a freelancer marketplace like something they can just do in a few minutes and churn out and put up, and they will be good to go. It takes time and effort to craft that compelling story for that specific marketplace, for that specific ICP. So the first thing that I would say is please take your time on this. Don't rush it. Make sure everything is thorough. A single spelling or grammar error can pretty much throw your entire profile off. So the first thing that I would say is don't rush it. Don't spray and play your applications. Like, you want to take your time on each and every one, which is why I said at the beginning, only do as many marketplaces as you can uphold quality and maintain your profile on. Because eventually, if you're applying across too many, then you're not going to have that quality. The second mistake, and this has to do with telling that story, is that people spread their expertise too thin. It's very possible that you have expertise and experience across a few different things, but if you're coming on a platform like the starters and saying that you are a chief marketing officer, a brand marketer, and a data analyst, that end customer is going to be like, I don't know what this person is telling the truth about,
Totally.
what they're actually great at, because there is no chance they can be great at all 3 things. And so telling a cohesive story of how you, with your 1 to 2 particular pieces of expertise in particular, can help a business is going to be really important. And it's important you don't dilute what you're fantastic, what you're the best at, with other things that you may have done in the past, but aren't necessarily your number 1 and number 2 skills. So the second biggest mistake that I see is just diluting your profile across too many things. The reason they're going freelancers is to hire the best in a particular area. They're not hiring one person who's a generalist across 30 things. And so I would say don't be dilutive when it comes to your profile. Focus on a couple specific things and make sure you stand out as the best authority on those things.
I love that second point. I think that's not only valuable for the person who's looking to hire you, but it's also valuable for your happiness in that role, right? If you are like, okay, I can do these 15 things, but like, we all know what our true strengths are and what we enjoy doing, right? So I think, if you're saying I can do these 15 things, I could do, data analysis, I can, put together some creative, I can write blog posts, I can also lead marketing teams, I can do X, Y, and Z. I think it's also important for that person to look inward and say, okay, yes, what am I the best at? But also, what do I enjoy doing? Because that's going to be the best client relationship and the best working relationship if I'm actually only going after projects that really fit where I am today and the kind of work that I want to do.
And if you're going to do those 15 things, you might as well be a founder like us and get the upside. Because I think the three of us do 15 to 20 things every single day, but we're founders and it's a completely different game.
Yeah, we are all gluttons for punishment. And
Yeah.
Andrew and I were actually just talking about that before this phone call. I was like, man, I am scattered. I am working on so many different things this week. I have no focus. I'm like, there's videos, there's recordings, there's social content, there's client work, there's all these things. So yeah, you don't want to be in that space if you don't have to. I think most people work better when they're really focused on what they're really good at, because that is how you provide that really valuable output. And when you're providing a valuable output to a company and they're seeing a ton of value from that, that's when you feel really fulfilled, right? You're like, I'm doing something that I love. The output is really valuable to this other person and I'm getting paid for it. That's like a recipe for like happiness in your work life, right?
Then it doesn't feel like work.
Yeah.
Yes. What other advice would you give to freelancers who are thinking about getting involved in a marketplace? I know that we've talked a little bit about the do's and the don'ts, but if somebody's listening in today and they're like, okay, I'm kind of talked into this, I might go search for marketplaces and make that an important channel for me. What other advice do you have?
Yeah, I think if you don't mind, I'll take a little bit of a step back. And what I think is important there is not only, I think the best advice that I can give outside of what I've shared is that understanding the freelance landscape and how it is changing is also going to be really important, especially if you're placing your bets on being a full-time freelancer. So I understand the landscape, and the way that I look at it, and I look at the pros and cons of that landscape, the way that I look at it is that you have your mass freelancer marketplaces, the ones with millions of freelancers, like the Upworks and Fivers of the world. The pros are that most brands are going to go there to hire. Their technology and onboarding process are going to be very smooth. But the cons is the quality of talent might not be the best. It is a race to the bottom in terms of rate, and you're competing with people if you're a US based freelancer, you're competing with people in other areas that have a lower cost of living and potentially could provide similar services, maybe not as high quality, but on the profile, similar services for a lower cost. So you need to know what you're getting into there. You also need to know the game that you need to play there in drumming up reviews. There's a lot of fake reviews on those platforms. If you don't have any, it's going to be really hard to win. So I think understanding that piece of it is really important. And then understanding the other side, which is the staffing agency networks that you can be a part of, where you're going to get higher quality clients. They're going to be larger businesses, and you're going to get the security of having just a lead generation tool without having to generate reviews or update a profile or anything of that nature. The con to that is once you enter into an engagement, then you are forever stuck with that intermediary, and they're going to be taking 50+% of what the client is actually paying. And if that client wants to hire you full time, guess what? They're going to charge you $30,000 to break that contract and go work with them full time. So I think as a freelancer, it's important to understand the marketplace, the pros and cons to each type of model where they could go out and freelance, and perhaps find that middle ground, perhaps by building their own personal brand, building their own networks, putting themselves out there, putting themselves on platforms like the starters where we're not taking a cut, the clients are high intent. And I'm sure there are other ones. I guess Working Not Working is a great example for creatives, where it's a little bit of a bigger marketplace, but it's paid for access. There are high quality brands using it. And so that's the advice that I would give them is understand the landscape, understand the different types of models and the pros and cons for each before you develop your personal strategy of how you're going to be acquiring clients.
I love that. And I think, even Andrea and I, who have been in freelancing for years and years and are building for freelancers, I feel like we sometimes don't understand the landscape with marketplaces, right? It's very complex. There's a lot of different marketplaces that serve a lot of different purposes. And so I love that you bring that up. You're like, hey, don't just dive in. do your research, understand how each of these marketplaces work, understand who they're best for, understand what the payout process, and really take that into consideration and calculate that out as you're thinking about your freelance future, right? Because I think sometimes when people dive into freelance, they just want to get that client really fast, right? And so you mentioned earlier, they might just like, spray their profile across all of these different platforms and just cross their fingers and hope for the best, right? But that's not actually how you build a sustainable business. And it's not how you make these marketplaces work for you long term.
That's exactly right. And, it's over time, more and more are going to spin up. It
Mhm.
is not hard to start a talent marketplace. It's actually very simple. The barriers to entry are very low. It's very hard to do very well.
Mhm.
But there are going to be more and more entrants. And when it comes to take rate, I hope that it's going to be a race to the bottom in terms of how low can take rates get, because there's
Yeah.
always going to be a new entrant. So I'd be looking out for those new entrants who are taking less and less. I came across Contra the other day. They don't take anything at all.
Mhm.
I think there are constantly going to be new entrants like that, like them, like us, like Working Not Working, that aren't taking a cut at all. And the landscape's going to become even more fragmented and more diverse. And so there
Mhm.
are a ton out there. I've been doing this for 8 months and paying attention to my competitors, but new ones that are massive still pop up every day for me.
Yep.
So imagine, how many options there are for a freelancer that doesn't spend all their time looking at the market. So yeah, taking some time there can be really helpful, and can honestly change the trajectory of your career. Right? Like if you're only working with low cost clients, you're charging 20, 30, $40 an hour, you're getting paid only hourly. That's one trajectory. Or if you start working with higher quality clients, you start moving them to retainers where you're not charging based on an hourly basis. You're charging based on your expertise and a flat monthly cost. And over time, you can slowly build that up. So that's why I think it's really important.
Yes. I mean, I want you to give yourself a little bit more credit because you're like the barrier to entry is so low, and building any
That's not.
building any business is hard. What you are doing is very hard and takes a lot of dedication. But you're right. People are entering into, the marketplace world in a number of different ways. And it's actually one of the things that Andrew and I talked about when we were, going to have this conversation with you. We're like, oh, it's really cool that you are focusing on e-commerce very specifically, right? You're like, I am helping a very specific subset of freelancers. I'm helping a very specific subset of companies, and I am going to make that match as valuable as possible. And I love that really niche approach that you're taking.
Yeah, my thinking there is, what is the business that I am one of the most, if not the most qualified person to go start?
Yep.
And where am I going to get that unfair advantage? And when it comes to e-commerce, and not only e-commerce, we're focusing on marketing, creative, and technology. Those
Yeah.
are the three teams that I used to lead and that I know how to hire for, how to vet for, and the needs of e-commerce businesses at every single stage. So that piece was really important to me. Secondly, e-commerce businesses need freelancers more than any other type of business. It is so cyclical when it comes to the macroeconomic environment, consumer confidence, and seasonality.
Yeah.
Most e-commerce businesses are either staffed for quarters 1 through 3 or overstaffed for Q4. But in reality, they need to have flexible staffing needs depending on what time of year it is. When it comes time for Q4, you have to create a lot more assets. You need more hands on deck and you need to staff up. And then
Yep.
Q1, Q2, you need to staff down. So freelancers in this market are incredibly important, which was definitely, a value prop for me. But really, I wanted to focus on what was my unfair advantage. What would I be qualified to lead, and what kind of company can I start based off of that?
That's amazing. Well, Jay, you're clearly an expert when it comes to marketplaces, when it comes to e-commerce specifically. If people are listening in right now and they want to go out and find out more about marketplaces, or they want to find out more about the starters, or they just want to have a conversation with you, where can they find you? Where can they get in touch?
Yeah. Yeah, so they can find me on Twitter at jdolwani, on LinkedIn, and if they want to check out the starters, go to hirethestarters.com. We have resources for freelancers, for brands looking to hire, as well as some comparison guides between us and our bigger competitors on kind of both sides of that marketplace that I mentioned, although they might be just a little bit biased. I'm very proud of what we do and have no shame in that. But yeah, this was a really enjoyable conversation. And anyone interested in the freelance space, whether it's relevant or not to the starters, happy to help out how I can. And my passion really is in figuring out ways for businesses and founders to grow sustainably, because as we all know, being a founder is incredibly difficult. And I would love to figure out how I can continue to solve problems for early stage founders.
I love that. And for the record, I'm also biased towards the starters. So you should definitely go check them out. If you want to get in touch with either Andrea or I after this, or Harlow, we are on most of the same social platforms that Jay just mentioned, but I am at Samantha Anderl across LinkedIn and Twitter and Instagram, on TikTok. And then Harlow is at Meet Harlow on all of the same platforms. Andrea is not as active on social media. You can find her on LinkedIn. I always cue her up for this, and she's like, Sam,
why do you do this?
I'll do this.
Every time.
Every time. So if you want to get in touch with Andrea, get in touch with me, and I will send on the message.